When I was 18, life had already thrown me into the deep end. Violet, my daughter, was born that year, and while some might have seen it as the end of my carefree youth, I saw her as the beginning of everything. Odessa, my high school sweetheart, stood by me, strong and steady. We were young, naive, and wildly optimistic about the future. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that felt like enough. The next few years were a blur of late nights, early mornings, and hard work. I threw myself into building a career while Odessa focused on raising Violet. Somewhere along the way, though, we started drifting. It wasn't one big fight or dramatic moment. It was 1,000 tiny things we didn't fix in time. By the time we divorced, it was clear we weren't the same kids who'd vowed to take on the world together. Still, Odessa and I managed to stay on good terms. For Violet, yes, but also because there was an unspoken respect between us. We knew we'd given it our all and refused to let bitterness take root. Even as I moved forward in my life, Odessa was always a part of it. Someone I could count on, no matter what. Years later, when Cassandra walked into my life, she seemed like everything I didn't know I needed. Polished, charming, and fiercely intelligent, she had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room. She was the kind of woman who turned heads and knew exactly how to use it. When we married, I thought I'd finally found someone who could match my ambition and share my dreams. But dreams have a funny way of twisting into nightmares when you least expect it. Cassandra had plans of her own, plans that had nothing to do with love or partnership. At the time, though, I was too blinded by her beauty and confidence to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface. It started small, as these things often do. A few offhand comments about our finances, a sudden interest in the risks I was taking with my investments. I chalked it up to her wanting to be involved in my world, to share in my success. How wrong I was. I should have seen the signs sooner, but when you're in love, or at least think you are, you convince yourself that everything is fine. It wasn't. Cassandra wasn't fine. And soon, neither was I. At first, it was easy to brush off the little things. Cassandra's late-night texts, just work, she'd say with a casual wave. Her sudden need for space when we used to share everything. The way she'd seem preoccupied during dinner, her fingers dancing over her phone under the table. I'd ask, jokingly, who's got your attention more than me? And she'd laugh it off, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I'm planning something special, she'd tease. You'll see. I wanted to believe her. After all, she was my wife. She was supposed to be my partner, my confidant. But there was something off. The way she'd get defensive when I asked about her day, the vague answers that never quite added up. And then there were the expenses. At first, they were minor, extra charges on the credit card for spa days, shopping trips, dinners with friends. But then they grew, luxury handbags, first-class tickets for solo trips, jewelry I'd never seen her wear. When I asked her about it, she'd roll her eyes and say, Winston, you make more in a day than most people do in a month. Don't act like you can't afford to spoil your wife. It was hard to argue with that. She wasn't wrong. I'd done well for myself. But the way she said it felt wrong, like my success was nothing more than a resource for her to exploit. Still, I pushed the doubt aside. Love isn't supposed to keep score, right? The turning point came when Odessa called me one evening. She rarely reached out unless it was about Violet, so her voice, calm, but with an edge of urgency, immediately put me on alert. Winston, she said, I need to talk to you. It's about Cassandra. Hearing her name from Odessa's lips felt strange, like two worlds colliding. I laughed it off, trying to diffuse whatever tension was building. What, you've got dirt on my wife now? What are you, my private investigator? Odessa didn't laugh. Maybe you should get one, she said quietly. And then she hung up. I sat there, staring at my phone, the silence pressing in around me. Odessa wasn't one for dramatics. If she said something like that, it wasn't a joke. That night, for the first time, I felt the cracks in my marriage begin to widen. Something was wrong. And I was finally ready to admit it. Odessa's words haunted me. I wanted to ignore them, pretend she was overreacting or misinterpreting something. But deep down, I knew better. Odessa was sharp, observant. She wouldn't have said anything without reason. Still, I hesitated to take action. Confronting Cassandra felt too extreme, too premature. What if I was wrong? What if this was all a misunderstanding? I told myself I'd wait, watch, gather my thoughts. But watching only made things worse. The inconsistencies became glaring. Cassandra's work trips seemed more frequent, yet there was no evidence of any real work. Her explanations for the charges on our accounts became flimsier, riddled with contradictions. And then there were the late-night phone calls. She'd step outside to talk, her voice low, hushed, carrying that strange tone, half playful, half secretive, that made my skin crawl. One night, after she slipped out of the bedroom for yet another call, I followed her. I stayed far enough back, careful not to make a sound. She was standing by the kitchen window, her silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of her phone. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough to make my stomach churn. He's completely clueless. Honestly, it's almost too easy. I just need a little more time to sort the paperwork. Don't worry, Brad, it's all under control. Brad. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know who he was, but I knew what he was. My blood ran cold, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid she'd hear it. I slipped back to the bedroom before she could notice I was gone, my mind racing. That was the first time I truly accepted what I had been trying to deny. Cassandra wasn't just distant or distracted. She was playing me. And not just emotionally. This was bigger. More calculated. The next morning, I called Odessa. You were right, I said, my voice tight. There's something going on. I need your help. Odessa didn't hesitate. Whatever you need, Winston, she said firmly. We'll figure this out. And just like that, I had an ally. Someone who knew me better than anyone, someone I could trust completely. Together, we decided to dig deeper, to uncover the full extent of Cassandra's betrayal. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting everything I'd built, for myself and for Violet. The truth was out there. I just had to find it. With Odessa's support, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, though it was tinged with a deep unease. The more I thought about Cassandra's behavior, the harder it was to dismiss the growing pile of inconsistencies. Her late-night phone calls, unexplained trips, and the way she always seemed to be one step ahead of my questions, it all painted a picture I didn't want to see. But the pieces were there, waiting for me to put them together. Odessa suggested bringing in a private investigator, someone who could dig deeper without tipping Cassandra off. Through one of her contacts, we hired Carl, a no-nonsense retired detective known for his thoroughness. He assured me that whatever was happening, he'd uncover it. His confidence was unnerving, but I knew it was exactly what I needed. While Carl began his work, I started paying closer attention to Cassandra. It wasn't difficult to spot the lies once I was actively looking for them. One evening, she mentioned plans for a night out with a friend, Lisa. The way she said it was casual, almost dismissive, but something felt rehearsed. Later, as she got ready to leave, I made a mental note of the details. Her outfit, her choice of perfume, even the time she walked out the door. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't Lisa she was meeting. When Carl called me that night, his findings left no room for doubt. Cassandra wasn't with Lisa. She was at an upscale restaurant downtown, sitting across from a man. Carl had photos. Clear, undeniable evidence. They weren't subtle, either. Cassandra leaned in close, her hand brushing his arm as they talked. The expression on her face wasn't one of caution or guilt, it was comfort, ease. She wasn't hiding anything because she didn't expect to be caught. The photos were just the beginning. Carl also managed to retrieve copies of emails between Cassandra and her companion, a man named Brad. The messages were damning. Not only were they personal, filled with flirtation and familiarity, but they revealed a calculated plan. Cassandra had been feeding Brad details about my finances, discussing potential investments, and even joking about how easy it was to manipulate me. The coldness of her words, the complete lack of remorse, hit me harder than I thought possible. I stayed up the entire night, going through everything Carl sent me. The evidence painted a clear picture. Cassandra wasn't just unfaithful, she was deceitful on a level I hadn't imagined. She wasn't just cheating on me emotionally, she was actively working against me, using my trust as a weapon. The betrayal was overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't act on raw emotion. Confronting her without a plan would only give her a chance to lie, to twist the situation in her favor. I needed to be strategic, careful, and deliberate. This wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about dismantling whatever she and Brad were building before it could do real damage. Odessa was the first person I turned to after processing everything. She understood the depth of what I was dealing with and reminded me to stay focused. This wasn't just about exposing Cassandra, it was about protecting everything I'd worked for, everything that mattered to me. The next steps were clear. Cassandra's games were coming to an end. She just didn't know it yet. With the evidence in hand, it was no longer a question of if Cassandra was betraying me, but how far she had gone. Her lies weren't careless slips, they were deliberate, woven into a carefully constructed plan. She had underestimated me, though, and that would be her downfall. The first thing I did was quietly sever her access to our finances. It took a few phone calls and meetings with my financial advisor, but within a day, Cassandra's joint access to our accounts was frozen. Her credit cards were cancelled, and I began moving assets into secure holdings under my sole control. I didn't want her to notice yet, so I left her primary account untouched, just enough to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed. Meanwhile, Carl continued to dig, uncovering more details about Cassandra and Brad's relationship. The emails revealed that Brad wasn't just some fling. He was her partner in crime, the one she leaned on to execute her schemes. The two of them had been transferring small amounts of money into offshore accounts for months, building a safety net I hadn't even realized existed. It was methodical, calculated, and infuriating. I shared everything with Odessa, who, as always, approached the situation with calm logic. Her ability to think clearly under pressure was exactly what I needed. Together, we crafted a plan, a way to confront Cassandra on my terms, where she couldn't deny or manipulate her way out of the truth. The opportunity came when Cassandra suggested a weekend getaway, something romantic to rekindle our connection. I almost laughed at the irony. She had no idea that her suggestion played perfectly into my hands. I agreed, acting as though I was eager for the time away, and even suggested a secluded cabin near the lake, a place where we wouldn't be interrupted. The days leading up to the trip were excruciating. Cassandra went about her routine as if nothing was wrong, completely unaware that I knew everything. Her ability to lie so effortlessly, to act so normal, made my stomach churn. But I played along, biding my time. When the weekend arrived, I packed light, keeping only the essentials, and the evidence Carl had gathered. As we drove to the cabin, Cassandra chatted about meaningless things, her voice cheerful, her demeanor relaxed. It was almost enough to make me doubt what I knew. Almost. The cabin was quiet, nestled in the woods with no one around for miles. Cassandra seemed pleased, even excited, as she unpacked and poured us both glasses of wine. I watched her carefully, trying to understand how someone I'd once trusted completely could become so unrecognizable. Later that evening, when she suggested we sit by the fire, I knew it was time. I brought out the folder Carl had given me and set it on the table between us. Her smile faltered as she glanced at it, confusion flashing across her face. "What's this?" she asked, her voice suddenly cautious. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I opened the folder and began laying out the contents. Photos of her with Brad, screenshots of their emails, bank statements showing the transfers. With each piece of evidence, her expression shifted, from confusion to panic, then to a carefully crafted mask of indifference. "I don't know what you think this proves," she said finally, her voice cold. "But whatever it is, it's not what it looks like." Her words were almost laughable. The sheer audacity of her denial only fueled my resolve. This wasn't the moment for confrontation or arguments. This was the moment to watch her realize that her game was over. For a moment, Cassandra sat there, her hands resting on her lap as if she wasn't staring at the very evidence of her betrayal. Her composure would have been impressive if it weren't so calculated. She leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the papers spread out before her. "I see you've been busy," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge that betrayed her frustration. "But none of this means anything, Winston. You're reading too much into innocent things." I stared at her, stunned by how easily she dismissed everything. The photos, the emails, the bank records, it was all there, undeniable. Yet here she was, weaving her web of deceit with the same confidence that had once drawn me to her. It was almost surreal. "Innocent things?" I said, my voice calm but steady. "Meeting Brad for dinner behind my back is innocent?" Sending him details about my investments is innocent? Transferring my money to offshore accounts is innocent. Her expression flickered, just for a second. A crack in her armor. Then she scoffed, crossing her arms. You're paranoid. Those emails were taken out of context. Brad is an old friend, nothing more. And as for the money, I was trying to protect us. You've been taking such reckless risks lately. I was just trying to make sure we had a safety net. It was almost impressive how quickly she twisted the narrative, turning herself into the victim and me into the irrational husband. But I was done playing her game. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. I've already frozen the accounts, I said evenly. Brad can't touch another cent. And as for your safety net, I've traced every transfer. You've been skimming off the top for months, Cassandra. This wasn't about protecting us. This was about protecting yourself. Her face went pale, the confidence draining from her expression. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between us was deafening. You underestimated me, I continued. You thought you could lie your way out of this, manipulate me like you always do. But it's over. I've already filed for divorce. And thanks to the prenup, you'll walk away with nothing. Her reaction was immediate. She shot up from her chair, her composure completely shattered. You can't do this to me, she snapped, her voice shaking with anger. You think you're so clever, but you'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. I didn't flinch. Her threats, her anger, it didn't matter anymore. She had played her hand, and now the game was done. Do whatever you want, Cassandra, I said quietly. But you won't get another cent from me. And if you try anything, I'll make sure the authorities know everything. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, her fists clenched at her sides. Then, without another word, she stormed out of the cabin, slamming the door behind her. I didn't follow. I sat there in the quiet, staring at the mess of papers on the table, feeling a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Cassandra's lies had unraveled, but I knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't the type to let go without a fight. Still, for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control over my life again. Whatever came next, I was ready. The hours after Cassandra stormed out were eerily quiet. The cabin, which once felt like a serene retreat, now felt heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed by the fireplace, replaying every moment, every lie, every sign I had ignored. Morning came slowly, but with it came a sense of clarity. Cassandra was gone, and for now, that was a good thing. It gave me time to regroup and figure out my next move. I knew she wouldn't disappear quietly. She wasn't the type. Her pride wouldn't let her leave without trying to claw back something, even if it meant tearing me down in the process. By the time I got back to Savannah, I already had a plan in place. Odessa met me at my house, her calm presence grounding me as I laid everything out. I told her about the confrontation, Cassandra's threats, and my growing certainty that this was far from over. Odessa nodded, her expression thoughtful. She's not going to take this lying down, she said, echoing my own thoughts. You need to be prepared for whatever she tries next. Preparedness became my focus. I worked with Carl to secure more evidence, making sure every email, every transfer, every photo was documented and ready to use if Cassandra tried to spin the story in her favor. I contacted my lawyer to expedite the divorce proceedings, ensuring Cassandra would have no opportunity to delay or complicate the process. Despite my efforts, Cassandra's retaliation came swiftly. She started with manipulation, reaching out to mutual friends and spinning her version of events. She painted herself as the victim of my paranoia, claiming I had driven her away with baseless accusations. Some people believed her. Others knew better. It didn't matter. I wasn't playing for public opinion. I was playing to protect what mattered most. The turning point came when Cassandra went too far. In a desperate attempt to regain control, she started making veiled threats involving Violet. She insinuated that she had information that could damage our family's reputation, hinting that she wouldn't hesitate to use it if I didn't reconsider the divorce terms. That was the line she shouldn't have crossed. Violet had nothing to do with this mess, and I wasn't about to let Cassandra drag her into it. I forwarded her threats to my lawyer and to Carl, who advised me to document everything. With Odessa's help, we prepared a counterstrike, one that would ensure Cassandra's tactics wouldn't just fail, but backfire entirely. I knew Cassandra wasn't just driven by greed, she was driven by control. The thought of losing, of being outmaneuvered, was intolerable to her. And that was exactly what I intended to do, outmaneuver her at every turn until she had no moves left. As the days passed, I felt the tide turning. Cassandra's lies were beginning to unravel, her threats losing their bite. But I wasn't done yet. There was still more to do, more steps to take to ensure she couldn't come back to haunt me or my family. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And I wasn't going to stop until it was done. Cassandra's threats had crossed a line I didn't think even she would dare to approach. Bringing Violet into this mess was her first and biggest mistake. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was war. With Carl's meticulous documentation and Odessa's sharp instincts, we began crafting the next phase of the plan. The key was patience and precision. Cassandra's biggest weapon was her ability to spin narratives, but she had underestimated my ability to anticipate her moves. Every lie she told, every threat she made, was like a thread unraveling from a larger tapestry. The more she pulled, the closer she came to exposing herself completely. First, I cut her off socially. Friends she had charmed with her lies were given just enough information to cast doubt on her stories. Screenshots of the emails, evidence of her siphoning funds, and recordings of her veiled threats began to circulate discreetly. I didn't broadcast the truth to the world, just to the people who mattered. Slowly but surely, the walls she had built around her carefully curated image began to crumble. Next, I focused on the legal front. My lawyer filed a motion to freeze any additional assets Cassandra might have tried to touch, and the evidence of her offshore accounts became the centerpiece of our case. The prenuptial agreement she had once dismissed as a mere formality was now her undoing. It was airtight, leaving her no legal ground to claim anything beyond what we had agreed to when we married, which, given her betrayal, amounted to nothing. Cassandra, predictably, didn't take this lying down. She hired her own lawyer, someone just as conniving and ambitious as she was, to try and contest the prenup. They argued everything from emotional duress to fabricated promises of shared wealth. It was laughable, really, watching her scramble to rewrite history in her favor. The court proceedings were tense, but I walked in prepared. My lawyer laid out everything with cold, calculated precision. The financial transactions, the private investigator's findings, and even her threats involving Violet. By the time we were done, Cassandra's mask of confidence was slipping, her lawyer visibly flustered by the mountain of evidence against her. But the real blow came when Odessa testified on my behalf. She recounted the moment she discovered Cassandra's emails, the steps we took to verify the truth, and the impact Cassandra's actions had on me and Violet. Her words were measured, but there was an undeniable strength in her voice, a quiet conviction that left no room for doubt. Cassandra's lawyer tried to discredit her, but Odessa remained unshaken. She was the picture of integrity, and her testimony was the final nail in Cassandra's coffin. By the end of it, the judge ruled firmly in my favor. Cassandra's claims were dismissed, her threats backfiring spectacularly. Not only was the divorce finalized on my terms, but the evidence of her fraudulent activity was forwarded to the authorities for further investigation. For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Cassandra's grip on my life had been severed. She had lost and I had won, not just for myself but for Violet and for the life I was determined to rebuild. Still, I knew this wasn't over. Cassandra was the kind of person who thrived on chaos, and I doubted she'd disappear quietly. But for now, I had the upper hand. And I wasn't about to let it go. With the divorce finalized and the court ruling in my favor, I expected Cassandra to retreat, at least for a while. But I had underestimated her capacity for desperation. Losing her grip on my life seemed to ignite something even more vicious within her. A final, reckless attempt to claw back what she could. It started subtly, like a shadow creeping into the corners of my life. Anonymous emails began flooding my inbox, full of baseless accusations and veiled threats. "You're not as untouchable as you think," one of them read. Another claimed, "You'll regret making me your enemy." Though they weren't signed, the tone was unmistakable. It was Cassandra, grasping at straws. I ignored the emails at first, but then she escalated. My colleagues in the cryptocurrency world started receiving similar messages, painting me as a fraud, accusing me of laundering money through my investments. Though most of them dismissed the claims outright, the whispers were enough to plant seeds of doubt. Cassandra was playing dirty, hoping to tarnish my reputation out of spite. Odessa was the first to notice the toll it was taking on me. "She wants a reaction, Winston," she said one evening as we sat in my living room, reviewing the latest round of emails. "Don't give her the satisfaction." But it wasn't just my professional life she targeted. Cassandra turned her attention to Violet, spreading lies to mutual acquaintances and even attempting to reach out to her directly. She tried to frame herself as the victim, claiming that I had manipulated the situation and turned everyone against her. Violet, to her credit, saw through the act immediately and blocked her. Still, the audacity of involving my daughter left me seething. Rather than lash out, I chose to fight back strategically. Carl and I began tracking the source of the emails and messages, gathering more evidence of Cassandra's harassment. Each new attempt she made only strengthened my case against her. I documented everything, preparing for the inevitable moment when her actions would cross the line into legal territory. And then it happened. Cassandra, in one of her more reckless moves, attempted to siphon funds from one of my cryptocurrency accounts. She must have thought I'd left it vulnerable, but I'd already taken precautions. The transaction was flagged immediately, and my financial team traced it back to an account linked to her and Brad. It was the smoking gun we needed. With this evidence, I contacted law enforcement. The case had shifted from a bitter divorce to criminal activity, and Cassandra's actions were finally catching up to her. Watching the pieces fall into place, I felt a sense of vindication. For weeks, she had tried to tear my life apart, but now the tide was turning in my favor. Still, there was a part of me that felt uneasy. Cassandra wasn't the type to give up easily. Even as her world began to collapse around her, I knew she'd find a way to lash out one last time. Cassandra's attempted theft marked a turning point. Her recklessness had left a trail, one that law enforcement followed with precision. It wasn't just my account she had targeted. Brad, her co-conspirator, had been using similar tactics with other unsuspecting victims. Together, they had built a web of financial deception, but now it was unraveling. When the authorities moved in, they did so decisively. Brad was arrested first, his offshore accounts seized, exposing years of fraudulent activity. The evidence tied Cassandra directly to the schemes, leaving her with no room to maneuver. She was brought in for questioning, her confidence shattered, her mask slipping further with each passing day. But even as the legal system tightened its grip on her, Cassandra found a way to deliver one final act of defiance. She began spreading rumors, reaching out to anyone who would listen, claiming that I had orchestrated the entire situation to frame her. Her narrative was desperate and full of holes, but it was enough to cause a ripple of doubt among those who didn't know the full story. This time, I didn't let it rattle me. With Odessa's encouragement, I remained focused, presenting the truth through the evidence we had painstakingly gathered. Every accusation Cassandra made was met with facts, emails, transaction logs, and testimony from Carl and others who had seen her true nature firsthand. Her attempts to smear me only added to her downfall, painting her as erratic and untrustworthy in the eyes of the court and the public. The legal proceedings were grueling, stretching over weeks. Cassandra fought tooth and nail, her arrogance refusing to let her admit defeat. But the weight of the evidence was undeniable. In the end, the court not only upheld the divorce terms but also found her guilty of financial fraud and criminal harassment. She was sentenced to prison, her carefully constructed life reduced to rubble. I sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read, a strange mix of relief and exhaustion washing over me. It wasn't joy I felt. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone I had once loved fall so far. But there was justice. And that was enough. With Cassandra out of the picture, I expected a sense of closure, but the aftermath was more complicated. The damage she had tried to inflict lingered, like the fading echoes of a storm. There were still questions to answer, loose ends to tie up, and wounds to heal. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Odessa remained by my side through it all, her steady presence a constant reminder of what truly mattered. Together, we began to rebuild. Not just my life, but the sense of stability and peace that had been missing for so long. Cassandra's story was over, but mine was far from finished. There was still work to do, and I was ready to face it head-on. With Cassandra sentenced and Brad out of the picture, the chaos that had consumed my life finally began to settle. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't waking up to threats or schemes, wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. But the quiet didn't bring instant relief. It was more like standing in the aftermath of a storm, trying to make sense of the wreckage. The first priority was Violet. Throughout the entire ordeal, I had done everything I could to shield her from the worst of it, but I knew she had felt the tension. She was smarter than I sometimes gave her credit for, and though she didn't ask many questions, her guarded expressions told me she was paying attention. I owed her answers. And stability. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, I decided it was time to talk. I kept the details simple, explaining that Cassandra had made bad choices that hurt people, including me. I assured her that everything was being handled and that she didn't need to worry anymore. Violet listened quietly, her eyes fixed on mine, and then with the blunt honesty only a teenager can muster, she asked, "So, she's gone for good?" I nodded. "Yes, she's gone for good." That seemed to satisfy her. She leaned against me, her small gesture of trust filling me with a resolve I hadn't realized I needed. Whatever came next, I was determined to give her the sense of security she deserved. Meanwhile, Odessa became an even bigger part of my life. She had been my rock throughout the chaos, her calm logic balancing my anger and frustration. As we spent more time together, I found myself wondering how we had ever drifted apart in the first place. The bond we shared felt deeper now, forged by everything we had been through. It wasn't just about nostalgia or comfort, it was about trust, something Cassandra had shattered but Odessa had quietly rebuilt. Odessa, as always, approached things pragmatically. She suggested we start focusing on what the future could look like, both for me and for Violet. "You've spent so much time reacting to everything Cassandra threw at you," she said one evening. "Maybe it's time to start building something for yourself again." Her words stuck with me. I had spent months consumed by Cassandra's schemes, letting her dictate the narrative of my life. Now that she was gone, I realized I had a chance to reclaim that narrative, to shape it on my terms. I threw myself back into my work, channeling my energy into new projects and investments. The cryptocurrency market had shifted since Cassandra had tried to meddle in it, but I found myself more focused and cautious than ever. Each decision I made felt deliberate, grounded in a sense of purpose rather than the need to prove anything to anyone. But it wasn't just work that mattered. Slowly, I began to reconnect with the things I had neglected, the hobbies that once brought me joy, the friendships I had let slip away, and most importantly, my relationship with Violet. The days became less about survival and more about living. Through it all, Odessa was there, not pushing or pressuring, just present. And as the weeks turned into months, I found myself wondering if our story wasn't finished after all. Maybe, just maybe, we had a chance to write a new chapter together. As the dust settled, life began to feel normal again, or as close to normal as it could after everything that had happened. The shadows Cassandra had cast over my life started to fade, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. Odessa had been a constant presence throughout the chaos, but now, in the calm, her importance grew even more. Our conversations became longer, deeper, more personal. We didn't just talk about Violet or the aftermath of Cassandra's schemes. We talked about us, about who we had become since the days when we were just two kids trying to figure out the world together. One evening, as we sat on the porch of her house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Odessa turned to me. "You seem lighter these days," she said with a small smile. "Like you've finally let go of something heavy." I nodded, realizing how true her words were. "I think I've just finally realized what matters," I said. "And what doesn't." It wasn't an epiphany, exactly. More like a slow, steady understanding that had built over time. Cassandra's betrayal had taught me hard lessons about trust and vulnerability, but it had also reminded me of the people who had always been there for me. People like Odessa, who never wavered, even when I didn't deserve it. As we sat there, the air warm and filled with the hum of cicadas, I found myself wanting to say something I hadn't let myself think about for years. But before I could, Violet came bounding out of the house, interrupting the moment with her usual exuberance. She held up her phone, excited about some video she'd just found, and Odessa laughed, her eyes crinkling in that familiar way that used to make my heart skip a beat. It was a small, fleeting moment, but it stuck with me. Watching Violet and Odessa together, laughing and talking like they'd never missed a beat, felt like coming home. For the first time, I started to believe that maybe we could have that again. Not the life we'd lost, but something new, something better. Over the next few weeks, Odessa and I continued to spend time together, slowly rebuilding the foundation we'd once shared. There was no rush, no pressure. Just an unspoken understanding that we were finding our way back to each other, one step at a time. In the meantime, my relationship with Violet continued to grow stronger. Without Cassandra's manipulations clouding my judgment, I was able to be more present for her, more attuned to her needs. We spent weekends exploring the city, trying new things, and just enjoying each other's company. She was thriving, and seeing her happy reminded me of what I was fighting for all along. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was good. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As time passed, the routines of daily life brought a sense of stability I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The chaos Cassandra had brought into my world was a distant memory now, a lesson learned and left behind. What mattered most was right in front of me. Violet's growing confidence, my renewed sense of purpose, and Odessa's steady presence by my side. Odessa and I didn't rush into anything. It wasn't about recreating what we had before. It was about something deeper, something that came from understanding the value of second chances. We started spending more time as a family, not just for Violet's sake but because it felt natural. We didn't label it or define it. We just let it happen. One evening, Violet suggested a dinner at our favorite old diner, the one Odessa and I used to take her to when she was little. The place hadn't changed a bit. The same checkered floors, the same worn leather booths, even the same waitress who recognized us immediately. Sitting there with Violet and Odessa, laughing and reminiscing, I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years. It was as though the three of us were rewriting our story, one moment at a time. It wasn't just the small things that shifted. Odessa and I started having conversations we'd avoided for years, addressing the wounds we'd left unspoken during our first marriage. It wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. We talked about the pressures of being young parents, the ways we had both felt isolated and overwhelmed, and how we could avoid making the same mistakes if we decided to try again. Those talks were honest, sometimes painfully so, but they brought us closer. The walls we had built between us came down, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but understanding. It wasn't about blaming the past, it was about learning from it, together. One day, as we walked along the riverside with Violet, she looked up at us and said, "You guys are happier now, aren't you?" Her observation was so straightforward, so innocent, that it caught us both off guard. Odessa smiled at her, then at me, and I nodded. "Yeah, we are." That night, as Odessa and I sat on the porch of my house, the same question lingered between us. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew what it was. Could we try again? And if we did, would it work? Odessa broke the silence first. "Winston," she said, her voice steady, "I don't want to go back to what we were. But I do want to see where we could go." Her words stayed with me long after she'd left that night. She was right. This wasn't about returning to the past. It was about building something new, something stronger. And for the first time I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, we could. The decision to try again wasn't sudden. It was a slow, deliberate choice. Odessa and I approached it cautiously, knowing what was at stake. Not just for us, but for Violet, who had already been through enough upheaval. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that what we were rebuilding wasn't just a relationship. It was a life, one that felt sturdier and more genuine than anything we'd had before. We didn't announce it to the world. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic declarations. Instead, it was in the little things, the way Odessa stayed for dinner more often, how our conversations deepened, how we started making plans as a family. Violet noticed, of course. She was too sharp not to. One evening, she even teased us, saying, "So, are you two dating again, or should I keep calling this a friendship?" Her grin was mischievous, but there was warmth in her tone, as though she was rooting for us in her own way. We laughed it off at the time, but her words stayed with me. It was a reminder of how much she had grown, how perceptive she was, and how much this second chance meant. Not just for me and Odessa, but for her too. As we spent more time together, Odessa and I started talking about the future in practical terms. Could we really make this work? What would it mean for us to become a family again? We didn't have all the answers, but we agreed on one thing. We wanted to try. It wasn't without its challenges. We had both changed since we were teenagers trying to raise a baby together. We had our scars, our insecurities, and our fears. But those same experiences also gave us a new perspective, a deeper appreciation for what we had. We were older now, wiser in some ways, and we knew how to communicate in ways we hadn't before. One evening, while we were sitting on the couch going through old photo albums with Violet, I came across a picture from the day she was born. Odessa looked so young in the photo, holding Violet with a mixture of exhaustion and joy. I stared at the image for a long time, memories flooding back, and then I looked at Odessa. She caught my gaze, her expression soft, and in that moment, I knew. The next morning, I told her I was ready. Ready to take the leap, ready to rebuild our life together, ready to see where this second chance could take us. She smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of hope and relief, and simply said, "Me too." From that point on, things moved quickly but naturally. We didn't force anything, but everything seemed to fall into place. Our families were thrilled, though some expressed surprise. "You two were always meant to be," Odessa's mother said one evening over dinner, her voice filled with affection. "You just needed some time to figure it out." As we began planning for the future, it became clear that this wasn't just about us. It was about creating a home, a foundation for Violet to thrive in and for us to grow together. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The day Odessa and I officially reunited wasn't marked by fanfare or dramatic speeches. It was a simple, intimate moment, a quiet acknowledgement that after everything we had been through, we had found our way back to each other. We didn't need grand gestures. We had already proven our commitment in the way we chose to rebuild our lives, one step at a time. Our decision to remarry felt natural, but we wanted to do it differently this time. It wasn't about impressing anyone or fulfilling expectations. It was about celebrating what we had become. We planned a small ceremony at the same riverside park where we'd taken Violet so many times. Only our closest family and friends were invited, people who had supported us through the ups and downs of our journey. On the day of the ceremony, the sun shone bright, casting a golden glow over everything. Violet walked beside Odessa, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers, her smile brighter than I'd ever seen it. She was a part of this union, not just as a witness but as the heart of what we were building. When Odessa and I exchanged vows, there was no need for flowery promises or overly sentimental words. We spoke from the heart, acknowledging our past mistakes, our growth, and our shared hope for the future. "You've always been my partner," Odessa said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Even when we were apart, I knew you were still with me in some way. This time, I won't let go." My voice faltered as I responded, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. "I've learned what matters now," I said. "It's not about success or chasing dreams alone. It's about us, building something that lasts, together." When we exchanged rings, it felt like more than a symbol. It was a declaration, a promise that what we had now was stronger, deeper, and more meaningful than anything we'd ever had before. The reception was small and full of laughter. Violet gave a speech that left everyone in tears and then quickly followed it with a joke that had the entire group roaring with laughter. As the evening wore on, Odessa and I danced under the string lights, her head resting against my shoulder, the weight of the past finally lifted. In the weeks and months that followed, we settled into a life that felt both familiar and entirely new. Our days were filled with the mundane joys of family life, sharing meals, planning trips, cheering Violet on at her school events. But it was the quiet moments, the shared glances, and the unspoken understanding between us that reminded me of how far we had come. Cassandra became nothing more than a distant memory, her influence over our lives extinguished. I occasionally wondered what became of her, but those thoughts faded quickly, replaced by the present, a life filled with love, trust, and the family I had fought so hard to protect. As Violet grew, so did the strength of our bond as a family. Odessa and I worked not only to nurture our relationship but also to create a home where Violet could thrive, knowing she was surrounded by love and stability. Looking back, I realized that the path to this moment had been anything but easy. But standing there, watching Odessa and Violet laughing together over something silly, I knew it had all been worth it. Love, trust, and resilience had brought us back together. And now, with a renewed sense of purpose and a life rebuilt from the ashes, we were ready for whatever came next, together.